What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards, old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. This week on Not Your Average Meta, we have another fun game that was filmed at the Hobby Horse in Taylorville, featuring the first time debut of 3 new decks. First up, we have Patrick bringing his new Toxrill the Corrosive deck to the table. This deck looks to use his commander along with some other removal in order to keep the board clear of creatures so he can overrun his opponents with slug monsters. Next, we have Gavin playing his newly constructed Beamtown Bullies deck. This deck looks to use his commander's ability to gift his opponents temporary creatures that in the end will ultimately hurt them more than help. Then we have Justin bringing back Adriana, Captain of the Guard. This deck is your classic Boros Knight melee beatdown deck that looks to win through extra combat steps. Finally, a Fogro playing his new double feature Edgar Charmed Groom deck. This is kind of a vampire tribal deck that was built strictly from Fog's vast collection of double feature cards, but really it was just an excuse for him to take his double feature obsession to the next level. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Gavin draws and plays a tap Stomping Grounds. Justin draws and plays a command tower for turn and then passes. Fog draws for turn and plays a Plains. He then pays 1 and casts an Unholy Officiant and ends his turn. Patrick draws, plays a Swamp, and passes. Gavin draws for turn and misses his land drop, discarding down to hand size. Justin draws and plays a Plains before paying 2 for Knight of the White Orchid, unfortunately not going to get a land. Fog draws and plays a Swamp for turn. He then pays 2 for a Wedding Invitation, drawing a card when it enters the battlefield. He then swings at Patrick for 1 damage and passes. Patrick draws and plays a Hostile Hotel for turn. He then pays 2 for Demonic Tutor, going to search for a card out of his library. Gavin draws for turn and plays the Badlands. He then pays 2 for Persist, targeting his Auric Lore Mage in his graveyard, returning him to play. Justin draws and plays another Plains for turn and then passes. Fog draws for turn and plays another Swamp. He then pays 3 for Markov Purifier and does the honors cutting Patrick's deck. He then goes to combat swinging his Officiant at Patrick again for another damage. Patrick draws for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He then pays the 1 to crack it to go get a basic island from his library. Patrick then pays 3 to cast a Gravelighter, making each opponent sacrifice a creature. Gavin draws and plays a Taiga for turn. He then pays 3 to cast Buried Alive, then goes to get 3 creature cards and put them into his graveyard. Justin draws for turn and plays a Mountain. He then pays 4 for Gallant Cavalry. He then gets a 2/2 Knight when it enters and he passes. Fog draws for turn and plays a Field of Ruin. He then taps out and casts his commander Edgar, Charmed Groom. Fog then goes to combat and swings his Purifier Gavin for 3 damage while he gains 3 life. Patrick draws for turn, then pays 3 for a Commander Sphere before passing. Gavin draws and plays an untapped Overgrown Tomb, paying the 2 life. He then casts his commander, the Beamtown Bullies, and passes. Justin draws for turn and plays a tapped Ondu Skyrunes before passing. Fog draws and plays another Swamp. He then pays 3 for Mask of Grizzlebrand before swinging his Purifier at Patrick for 3 life while he gains 3. Fog then pays the 2 to draw a card off his Purifier. Patrick draws and plays an island for turn. He then pays 3 for a Puppet Stitcher, but before he goes to combat, Gavin activates his commander to put a Tempting Worm into play under his control. Each of Patrick's opponents then gets to put any number of artifacts, creatures, or lands into play. Gavin puts an Archon of Cruelty into play, targeting Fog, who discards a card, loses 3 life, and sacrifices a creature, while Gavin draws a card and gains 3 life. Justin and Fog then drop all the permanents into play. After all ETB triggers have been resolved, Patrick then pays 2 to cast Feed the Swarm on Gavin's Archon of Cruelty, losing 8 life. He then creates a Decayed Zombie and swings his Worm at Justin for 5 damage. The Worm then gets exiled and he passes. Gavin draws for turn and plays a Homeward Path. He then pays 2 for a Hermit Druid and goes to combat, swinging his World Shaper at Fog, who doesn't block and takes a 3 damage. Gavin then mills 3 cards and passes. Justin draws and plays an untapped Spectator Seating for turn. He then pays 5 to cast his commander, Adriana, before casting a free Fury of the Horde by exiling 2 red cards from his hand. Justin then goes to combat, swinging his Token at Gavin, his Cavalry at Fog, and Corvath at Patrick. This then triggers his commander's melee ability, pumping up each of his creatures +3/+3. Everybody doesn't block and takes their damage. Justin then goes with second combat, and in response to this, Gavin uses his commander to put out a Bold War Heavyweights into play under his control. Each of Justin's opponents then get to search their library for any creature and put him into play. Fog puts in a Faithbound Judge, while Patrick puts in a Massacre Worm, which gives each of his opponents -2/-2 until end of turn. In response to the worm, Fog sacks his Olenbach Escort to put a +1/+1 counter on his Bat Whisperer. Each of Patrick's opponents then lose 2 life for each of their creatures that died. Gavin then puts to play a Balefire Dragon, and Justin finishes his second attack phase. This then pumps up his creatures an additional +3/+3. Fog blocks with his Judge but still takes 2 damage, and after many minutes of mathematical deliberation, the rest of the table then also takes their damage. At the end of his turn, the Heavyweights then gets exiled. On his upkeep, Fog puts a counter on his Coffin and creates a 1/1 Vampire and then draws for turn. He then pays to equip his mask to his Bat Whisperer and also enchants his Whisperer with a Gift of Fangs. Since his Bat Whisperer is a vampire, it pumps him up an additional +2/+2. Fog then goes to combat and swings his Whisperer at Justin for 7 damage while he gains 7 life. Patrick draws for turn and taps out to cast a Sludge monster. On ETB, Patrick chooses to turn Justin's dragon into a sludge. Before his combat step, Gavin activates his commander to put in a Phyrexian Obliterator into play under his control. Patrick then goes to combat swinging the Obliterator at Justin for 5 damage. On his end step, Gavin casts Noxious Revival to put his Druid back on top of his library. Gavin draws his Druid for turn and then recasts him for 2. He then swings his Balefired Fog for 6 damage while also dealing 6 damage to each of his creatures. Fog then loses 2 life for each creature that died while also paying 7 into his Mask of Grizzlebrand to draw 7 cards. Justin draws for turn and then casts Unbreakable Formation, putting a +1/+1 counter to each of his creatures while also making them indestructible. He then goes to combat swinging his Knight token at Gavin, his Cavalry at Fog, and his commander at Patrick. This then triggers his commander's melee ability, pumping up each of his creatures +3/+3. Patrick blocks with his Worm while Gavin and Fog each take their damage. On his upkeep, Fog puts a counter on his Coffin and creates a 1/1 Vampire and then draws for turn. Gavin then activates his commander to put the Archon of Cruelty into play under Fog's control. Fog then targets Gavin with the Archon ability, making Gavin sack your creature, discard a card, and lose 3 life, while he draws a card and gains 3 life. He then pays 2 to cast a Vanquish the Horde to wipe the board. In response, Gavin uses the Magerite Stone to untap his commander, who he then retaps to put an Enslaved Horror into play under Fog's control. Each player then returns a creature to play from their graveyard. Patrick chooses his Massacre Worm, putting it into play, which gives all of his opponent's creatures -2/-2 until end of turn. Each opponent then loses 2 life for each creature that died this turn. Gavin chooses to return his Worldgorger Dragon to play, which exiles all of his permanents. Justin chooses to return his Knight of the White Orchid to play, while Fog chooses his Escort, who he then sacks to put a 1/1 counter on his Archon, while also making him indestructible. Vanquish the Horde then destroys all the creatures besides the Archon, and Gavin returns his permanents to play. Fog then sends the Archon to Gavin, who has him discard a card, sacking your creature, and losing 3 life, while Fog gains 3 life and draws another card. Fog then casts when he enters the battlefield from the opponent lost life this turn, each opponent loses 2 life.
God damn it!
But before Gavin dies, he tries to save himself by using his commander to put the Enslaved Horror back into play under Fog's control. Everybody then gets to choose 1 creature from their graveyard and return them to play again. He then uses a stone to untap his commander before tapping him once again to put his Hermit Druid into play under Justin's control. Each of Patrick's opponents then lose 2 life for each creature that died from Massacre Worm coming back into play. After which, each of Fog's opponents then lose 2 life while he gains 2 life, taking Gavin out of the game. Patrick draws a turn before casting a Languish to wipe the board again. Each opponent then loses 2 life for each creature they controlled that died. Fog then pays 4 life to draw 4 cards through his Mask of Grizzlebrand. Justin draws a turn and plays a Mountain before he pays enough to recast his commander a second time. On his upkeep, Fog puts a 3rd counter on his Coffin and creates a 1/1 Vampire, which then flips his Coffin back into Edgar. Fog then pays 4 to cast Sorin the Mirthless, who he then downticks to create a 3/2 Vampire token before paying 3 to take out Patrick's Worm with a Hero's Downfall. Patrick draws and plays a Swamp for turn before passing. Justin draws for turn and swings his commander at Patrick for 5 damage. In response, Patrick casts You Find a Villain's Lair to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. He then floats a mana off his sphere before sacking to draw an additional card. He then doesn't find an answer and gets taken out of the game. Second main, Justin pays to cast Blasphemous Act, and in response, Fog casts Adamant Will in order to save his commander, and the board gets wiped once again. Fog draws return and then pays to equip his commander with the Mask of Grizzlebrand. He then casts Gluttonous Guest, creating a blood token. He then pays the 1 to sacrifice a blood token in order to draw a card and gain 1 life through his Gluttonous Guest. Fog then swings Edgar at Justin for 4 damage while he gains 4 life. He then upticks his Planeswalker to look at his top card, paying the 2 life to put it to hand. Justin draws return to recast his commander a 3rd time and passes. Fog draws return and plays another Swamp. He then upticks Sorin and reveals his top card, paying the 3 life to put it into his hand. Fog then casts Blood Servitor, creating a blood token, and then a Falconwrath Forebearer, creating a 2nd blood token. He then casts a Bleed Dry to take out Justin's commander and goes to combat, swinging Edgar Justin for 4 more damage while he gains 4 life. Justin draws return and knows he's defeated, so he scoops the game up to Fog.
Alright, so we have Fog Raw with another win, playing his degenerate decks. How does it feel to win again?
Feels pretty good to pick up another win, you know. Haters are going to say it's fake, but at this point it's about the same as walking or breathing. It just comes naturally, you know. But we'll see you next time for another great win. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.